Alright, how to use models. I feel like this is a very essential topic because full stack development in general has to be seen in a certain perspective. That if you don't get to see or realize that perspective, one stage you could sit down for hours and get stuck is creating your data models, because you'll be sitting down planning. So how do we solve that? We're going to solve that by basically getting to know or getting to get an idea of how to look at data models in the first place. All right, so data models. Before we talk about data models, I would want to open a much bigger view of how you should see things, right? So we have front end and back end, and at the end of the day, you want to be able to connect your front end and your back end. But you want to ask yourself, why do we even have the front end? Why do we even have the back end anyways? Can't they just be the same thing? Right. Now, here's what you want to be thinking about. The back end is there to display, is there to release data in a certain kind of way, depending on how you configure it to be released, right? But you can't release data you don't have. That is why we have a database to store that data before releasing it in the kind of way that we configure it to be released. And then the front end is there to create an interface whereby this data that has been released can display, so that the users who have problems and wants that problems to be solved can be able to use the data that has been generated by the backend in a more user-friendly way, or in a more easy way to solve their own problems. Now that we know this, we want to keep in our heads or in our minds that the main aim of the database is to be able to store data in such a way that we can display on the front end, right? Now that we know this, we need to, whenever we are creating our databases, we don't have to think too much. We just have to think, how can I store it in such a way that will be very easy for me to display this data on the front end, right? Now that we know this, we are going to just dive straight into building our data models for the various types of data sets that we are going to be releasing. So since it's an e-commerce store, we're going to have 4 data models mainly, depending on the type of project you're building. If in the future you start building projects with more complexity and you want to add more things to it, you can add them. But this is a common e-commerce store type thing, so because it's like that, we would mainly tackle just 4 data models, right? And they are the products, the users, the cart, and the cart, and also the order. So users have to place an order in general. Yes, so let us dive straight into it. Basically, we have this server file and server folder, and then we're going to create our models folder to models, and then inside the models we want to have cart.model.js. We have user.model.js. Then we have products, so product.model.js. Then we have order.model.js. Alright, Now let's create our models. Let's create our schemas. So we basically want to import mongoose. So we're going to import mongoose by requiring it from mongoose. Then we can const and then import our schema object constructor from our mongoose model. Then we can now create a model for the user. So we can say user model should be equal to new schema. New schema is going to be an object. So for the user, we want to keep in mind that the user is basically going to want to have a username in general. So we want to say that a username object. So the user is going to have a username field, right? So we're going to store. So I'm basically saying we want to store the user's username inside the username field. But how do we want to store it? What type of data do we want to store it in? We want to obviously store it as a string, right? So I want to set the type to string. Then we also want to make sure that it is required for the user to. So I'll say required. Without the username, we can't be able to create a user. That is what required being true states. Then we want to say that we want this username to be unique for every user, so that we wouldn't have to be getting different usernames. We wouldn't have to have multiple users using the same usernames. It makes it easy for us to query people out of the database or query documents out of the database using usernames, not just only IDs. So we set it to unique, and that is true. Now that we have this, we would want to add one more property or one more field. So obviously, or most of the time, not obviously, but most of the time in applications, you realize that users have emails. So email field, we store the emails inside the email field. And how do we store them? We store them as strings, right? So I want to set this to string, and then we want to make sure that these emails are required. So we want to say required is what? True. So we want to say it's required. And obviously the email needs to be unique. So we want to say unique is what? True. Now that we have the email, we want to add the password, because in order for you to create a user, you need to be able to store the passwords also. So we have the password field, which is going to store the password for each and every single user that is going to be created inside our database. So we're storing the passwords as what? Strings, obviously. Then we want to make sure that the passwords are also what? Required. You can't create a user without adding a password, obviously. So we have true for that. And then one more thing is we want to add a property to a user. We want to see if the user is an admin or not. So we'll say is admin, and then we're going to set that to, how are we going to store this value? Usually when we see s and a name or something, most of the time it's a boolean, or it's not like that's what it's supposed to be, but when it comes to storing this type of data, as in whether something is something or it's not something, you usually want to use, or you usually want to store that type of data as a boolean. So we have this type being boolean, and then we want to set the default. That is, if we create a user without passing in a boolean property to try to store the boolean value of the user, we would set the default of that value to be false. So if we create a user without adding the boolean value to it, or without creating a field for us to add the boolean value, we would automatically set it to false. So we would store every so basically I'm saying that every newly created user in the database is not going to be an admin until we perform some push requests to make such changes. I would get into that section when it comes to the requests and how requests and routes work in general. So we have the sysadmin working, and then what we want to add finally is timestamps, because you obviously want to keep track of the times users have been created and the times they've been updated and all these little things. We could use a property called, we could like create a property saying created at, then we'll use something like date dot now, use something like date dot now, but that is not necessary, right? That is not necessary. Mongoose already provides us a much simple way of performing such task by adding a timestamp to it. So we can add a timestamp, and then we can set that to true. So whenever we create a new user, we will be able to have the time that the user was created. I mean, not even just the time, but basically everything about the time, so that we can extract anything that we want to extract, whether it's an hour ago or you want to get the date, or so basically the time of manipulating the database, that is creating a user or updating the user or whatever you want to do. We would get the time that action was performed. Now that we have the user model created, we want to export it, obviously. So we'll say module dot export. When you say module dot export, then we want to say that mongoose dot model, then inside the first, it's going to take two arguments basically. Inside the first argument is basically going to be the name, or the name of the collection where you want to store this data, which is the user data, right? If we go to, let's go my first desktop, I'm going to, okay, so if we go to database here, I think I have to refresh this. Okay. So if we go into the database here, okay, it has to be loading up. If we go into the database and we browse collections, we would see, so here as you can see, we have this. Now the reason why I'm able to create data and get this name here is because in a previous project that I have worked with, when we get into the env file here, you can see that we have this extra extension at the end of the link, right? So because we know this, we can just create this extra section here saying so what name would we want to give to this? So we'd say e-commerce tutorial, e-commerce, or we'd say e-commerce MERN, right? E-commerce MERN. So whenever we store data, it's going to store it under the name of e-commerce MERN. Let me send this over to this desktop. So it's going to store it as e-commerce MERN, and then as you can see, food. So we have foods, we have restaurants, we have users, right? So the name that you're basically going to put in here, is what you're going to see over here, as in foods, and here first, as in foods and restaurants and users, right? And the here first here has to do with the name you put at the end of this link. So in our user model, we obviously want to store the username as users, and then, or just user, and then we would say, okay, now that we are storing it under the collection name of user, what model are we storing under that collection? We are going to store the user model under that collection, obviously. So we'd say user model has been, so we have been able to set this properly. Now what we want to do now is create the other models for the rest. We want to create the other fields for the rest of our models, right? So we just copy this, so just so we don't suffer that much, and then we paste. So after we paste like that, we want to now put in the fields for our product, right? Now our product, the first part of our product is, so let's change the name here. We're going to make this, so we're going to make this product model. We're going to make this the product model, and then we are going to basically say that this part is going to be a title. You're going to have a title here, then the title obviously is going to be a type of string, is going to be required, and is going to be unique. Then we want to have the description, obviously. So for the description, or I think we should shorten it. We should just make it this. We should make it this, right? Then now that we have this shortening, we want to make sure that the type is also string, and then it's required. There is no need for your description to be unique, right? Then we don't need a password, so we're basically going to replace this section with image, because obviously your product obviously needs to have an image, right? And then we're going to set the type of the image to be string, since we are going to have to use a media storing provider like Cloudinary or something to store the image and convert it into a string that can be applied, or that can be, so when it converts it into a link, we can be able to store the image in the database and also retrieve it onto our front end to display as an image. And then having that image field set, we want to add our category section. So we would set this to category, okay, or categories, because obviously the person might be trying to target multiple categories or something. Then we would set that to be an array, so an array of strings, right? An array of strings, we can set that like this. There are two ways of actually doing this. We could either do this as in set the type to be this string type of, so we can put in string and then put it inside the array notation, right? And then there's another way we can do this by just typing array. Either way it works. So after adding our categories, we want to go to the next one, that is going to be the size. And then we're going to add string. So basically we're going to say that the type is a string. We want to say that the size, right, the way we're going to be storing the size in that field is going to be a string. And then we are going to move on to the color. So just in case we are storing color, we want to store color also as a string. So color as a type of string. Then we have the price. Price also being a type string. Now that we have all these things working, and we already have our timestamp, so now that we have these working, we want to set the collection name to what? Product. And then we set that to what? The product model. Now that we've been able to work on the products, let's copy it and then drop it into the cart. Alright, now we've been able to drop our product model into the cart model, right? We want to be able to create the fields for our cart model. The first thing we want to do is obviously change the name here to cart model. Then for the title, we want to make that user ID. Why would we want to make that user ID? Come on, every product that is going to be put in any cart is going to be put in the cart by a user that is trying to shop. So you'd want to pass in the user ID so that you can perform your queries in the future and get that particular user that dropped the item in the cart, which will also help you make your orders in the future. Alright, so I mean, there are a couple of ways we could handle this. We could just take this out and then that's it. We just move on to the next section. But other people also like to handle this in a different way, and that is setting the type to mongoose dot objects mongoose dot schema dot types mongoose dot schema dot types. Then we set that to the object ID. So we set that reference to the user model, and then we say that it's required. Then we say the requirement is true, right? This is one way we can do it, but I just prefer the other one that we did before, just setting it to the type string and true, because I mean, at the end of the day, you're still going to pass in the user ID from your local storage or somewhere, I mean on the front end. Now that we have the user ID, we want to work on the product section. So we want to create our product here, the product field, And then so the product, we're going to handle the product like it's an array, because obviously your card or the product part of your card is going to be an array, obviously, and the array is going to contain different objects that contains the product information on there, right? So let's create the first object, saying that the first field inside the first object, or the field inside that object, is going to have a product ID, and then the product ID is going to be a type of string, a type being string. Then we're going to have let me clear this section. We don't need this part, so I'm going to we don't need this part. Obviously. Then after having the product ID there, we want to set the quantity, right? We want to set the quantity of the product we are trying to make an order for. So I want to set the quantity to, I want to set that to a number. So we say that the type of the quantity is going to be a number, obviously. Set that to a number. And bring my comma here, set that to a number, and then we set the default of this quantity to 1, because at the end of the day it's just one product that you'll be trying to purchase, unless the user wants to manipulate it, and then that can be handled later on. So we'd say that default is going to be 1, obviously. Now that we know this, we would want to just come down here and then make our requisite changes. So this is the cart model, so I'll just set this to cart, and then I'll set this to the cart model. Obviously. So we have the cart model set up now. We want to move straight into the order, so I'll just copy this and move into the order model. And then the only thing that we are going to change here is that we're just going to add a few things here. So beneath this, right beneath this product, I'm going to say that I'm adding an amount. So I'm going to add the amount here, and then I'll set the amount to a type, or I'll set the amount to a type of number, and then I'll make it required, right? So let's set it to a type number, and then let's make sure it's required before we can create an order. All right, we have that, and then we can move on to the status. So basically we can have two types of status, two types of products, or two type of orders. We have the orders that are pending, and then the orders that are completed. So we can basically get on here, and we can get on here and then set the status. We can set the status to, so we can just say it's a type string, obviously, and then we can say that by default we could say it's pending by default, because like the product is pending. So yeah, so it's pending. Or should we use in progress? I feel like everybody uses pending. Yeah, so I'll just say it's in progress, right? And then we could use completed later on. We could use completed, so when it's completed you would see completed. Okay, let's use pending. Obviously it makes it more simple to manipulate. So pending and completed. Right, so yeah, now that we know this, let's just set back to pending. You can just set to just simple pending. Alright, so we just change these things. We have this cart model being order, and then we can just set this to order. I think for I think we need to add one more field that is going to be address. Yeah, because obviously you're going to have to set your address for the product to be delivered to, right? So we want to say that the type of the address is going to be object, because the reason why we're setting this to object is because the person is going to basically passing a bunch of information, maybe address line 1, address line 2, state, zip code, these little things that we ask in the address, right? And then we want to make sure that it is required before we can create an order in the database. So true, yes. And then I think that should be it for, let me set this to the order model before we forget. Order model, set this to the order model before we forget. So basically that's it. Everything, but the summary of what we've learned is that your data models are basically objects. This is a non-relational database, so we create data based on document objects. So you have your username, and then the type, you can set the type to string, number, you can set it to string, number, you can set it to object, you could also set it to array. And I said that you can either set it to this array, or you can just set it to an array of strings, or you could also put in a boolean and set the default value. So you can say the default value of the boolean is true. And yeah, I mean, these are basically different ways you can store data in your database, right? So yes, and this is obviously, this part, the timestamps, is what is going to provide you with the time that the document was created and the time it was updated, so that in case you want to display any value or display any information based on time on a certain document or a certain data that you're displaying, you can easily do that by taking the timestamp property provided by the mongodb. And then basically for this part, I said that this is the collection name that you're going to find around here, so it's going to store it under this collection name. So for user, you're going to see users here, and then for this, it's going to store just this model inside the user part or the user collection, right? Thank you very much for watching this part of the video. I really hope you understood what I taught in this section. Feel free to ask me any questions you want to ask in the comments. And as you can see, we have rebranded the channel, and that is because I personally have been working on my startup for quite a while now. It was launched on the 1st of November 2023, obviously, and it is basically there to make the acquisition of knowledge profitable and more effective at the same time. So most of these videos, or in fact the rest of the videos that I'm going to be uploading here, I'm going to send the same videos to my startup channel or my startup website or web app, and then users or so basically users here who watch my videos and get knowledge from what I teach can move on or go into my website or my web app to rewatch the videos if they want to, and then after they answer the test questions that are below the videos. I believe that is going to help increase knowledge retention in the future, and also hopefully my users or my viewers over here might also be involved in teaching other topics, even if it's not related to programming. They can also upload their feeds onto the neural feed, and then through that I would be able to help use the multiple users that we have to negotiate with advertisers, or to negotiate with businesses to advertise on the platform, hence making it possible to monetize the contents that content creators will put on the neural feed. So thank you very much. If you think, I'll be very happy if you'd help share the neural feed so that people can upload content over there. And yes, thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.